Yeah, yeah. I mean, what I find really extraordinary is that nobody's really talking about how different life is going to be for young people when they're, you know, in 20 years' time, when they've got £50,000 debt overhang and they're in perpetual kind of rent servitude. Nobody's really talking about that, and it's quite a difficult thing politically to talk about without sounding depressing and depressing everybody. Yeah. What do you do about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to strike a balance, right? On the one hand, you've got to sometimes paint a negative picture to give people a little bit of a wake-up call. People sometimes say, Martin Luther King said, I have a dream, I have a nightmare. Well, that's true. But another great example would be Churchill, who went around saying, what I'm trying to do is to raise the alarm in the 1930s. He said, and there's a difference between being alarmist and raising the alarm. Right? And more people, well, oh no, there surely is, right? What he was trying to do was raise the alarm to say, you know, Germany's rearming, we have to do something about it, right? And he wasn't listened to in time, he should have been. And it's similar now with us with dangerous climate change, for example. So it's important for us to say, look, if you carry on voting for these guys, sooner or later, the planet's going to get it. And we have to stop before we get to that point. But what you also have to do, is offer people a positive vision.
Yeah.
And the wonderful thing is that, of course, you probably, many of you have seen that great cartoon which says, but what if we insulate all our roofs and start cycling and eat better food that's growing closer to home and stop polluting so much and so on, and it all turns out to be a hoax? But what if we make our lives better in every possible way and the climate change isn't happening? You know, the beautiful coincidence is that most of the very things we need to do in order to make the world better for ourselves ecologically and socially are the very things we need to do in order to stop these bad scenarios from happening.
I mean, somebody said they'd done an analysis on kind of great speeches of the 20th century, and it was amazing how few details there were in them, and how, you know, really inspirational political speeches don't have many details. They do just have a kind of vision of the future, and that is what, you know, that's sort of what's missing currently from the main parties, is they've got no place they want to get to. Now, do you, when you kind of characterise the places you want to get to, obviously it is a kind of greener, cooler planet, but there is a social equity element to it. Do you feel that they're ever in conflict, or do you feel that they're always in?
Well, there might be conflict sometimes, but again, I think they go together very, very neatly. So, for example, in terms of resisting austerity, and in terms of creating a more equal society. And of course, the other parties all talk about fairness, and they all talk about fairness, but they never talk about equality. You know, just that Labour never talks about equality anymore.
And why not?
Why not? Well, I think because they've given up on it. You know, they've sold out to the idea that the only game in town is, to use the phrase you mentioned earlier, the splendid phrase, neoliberalism, and the only game in town is growthism. And what they want to do is it's just a glorified version of trickle-down economics. There'll be a little bit more for people at the bottom if they play it the right way. And we say, no, growth is an alternative to sharing properly, and that's what we need to do. Right? So I think that the ecological crisis brings the social crisis and the crisis of inequality into much better focus. And when you realise, actually, we can't go on growing the pie forever because the ingredients are running out, then you realise we have to share. And that means things like literally sharing, literally sharing cars and so on and so forth. But it also means things like the rich paying more and the poor getting a better deal. So I think that the equality agenda and the ecology agenda in all sorts of ways go hand in hand.
Tell me what the specific situation is in Cambridge. I mean, you're obviously very hopeful for this seat, right? I mean, there are a lot of people who don't vote who could, and then that would be it.
Well, the key really is the point that Natalie made earlier about what if we reach Scottish levels of turnout. It could still happen. Because the key fact, of course, about our great demographic of younger people is that it has to be said that they are the least likely to vote traditionally. Right? There's a lot of young people in the room. I really hope that every single person in this room is going to break that trend and is going to vote.
I think if they turned up to this.
Yeah, hopefully that's a good sign. I really hope also though that you're all registered to vote, because remember, if you're not registered to vote, you cannot vote, and you only have a few days left, so don't miss that vote. If you were able to get the same level of turnout from young people as from older people here in Cambridge, that's the kind of thing that could be a game changer for us. It's possible. Because in young people now in the polls, we're polling level with or ahead of Labour nationally, which implies we'll be way ahead of that locally. In the latest Ashcroft poll for Cambridge, very, very interesting poll, that on the headline figure we're at 15%, which might not sound that much.
Hang on a second, you're on 15% in Cambridge?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
wow, that is pretty good.
It's not bad, because Cambridge is going to be a 5-way split. As we were saying,
really?
well, yeah, UKIP aren't going to do very well here, but they have a reasonably credible candidate in Patrick O'Flynn MEP. They're going to get a lot more votes than they did last time, and there's always a Conservative residual vote in Cambridge because they used to hold the seat, and their candidate is very hard working. So it's going to be a 5-way split here.
Say that like an intern.
There's going to be a 5-way split here. The winner here could win with 25% of the vote. Now, what the Ashcroft poll also said is that among 18 to 25-year-olds, the Greens in Cambridge are on 37%.
Wow.
Right? So imagine if we got young people in Cambridge voting not at 40%, which is the standard level, but at 80%. Well, then it is possible. It is possible for us to win. The big barrier we face, of course, is the thing you've talked about with Natalie. It's that there's still so many people in Cambridge who are like, oh, well, I kind of feel I have to vote Labour, or, oh, well, I kind of feel I have to vote Lib Dem. But sooner or later, we've got to break that pattern. They broke it in Brighton in 2010. People said, well, there's never going to be any change. There's never going to be any Green MPs. They can't say that anymore. So where are the next Green MPs coming from? They've got to come from a place like this. This was our 3rd best result in the whole country in 2010. If not here, then where? And if not now, then when?
Yeah. So I think there are bound to be people in the audience who can shed some light on what what will mobilise young people and who's staying away and who's not staying away. Does anybody want to give a view? You do. Look. You can talk without a microphone.
Yeah, no, recently the Conservative candidate said something about young people having to, well, anyone having to wear wristbands if they had a mental health problem. Obviously that's ridiculous. Firstly, what would the Greens do? And secondly, I think that's something which really got people in my friendship group at least engaged about mental health.
Well, I think it's great that people are engaged about mental health. It's an issue I feel very strongly on. One of the things we think in the Green Party is that the concept of a mental health emergency needs to be taken seriously. Right? When somebody's suicidal and somebody's psychotic, it's an emergency. And it's absolutely scandalous that you've had the kind of cuts you've had in many psychiatric services in recent years, which mean that when people are in that position sometimes, they've got no help. Now, I had an experience with this myself a few years ago. A close friend of mine was suicidal, and it was basically left to me and another friend and his GP to try to stop him from killing himself, which he came very, very close to doing. And at one point, at the height of this, we got on the phone to the crisis team, such as they were, in a very overstretched team, and we sort of said, look, we need to do this, we need to do that. And they said, they said to us, you're not going to believe it. They said, well, sometimes you've just got to let people go. That's absolutely straight up, that's what they said. And I'm not, as I say, totally blaming them because they're totally overstretched, they've been cut to the bone. On the other hand, I don't think, I can't see how that could possibly be an acceptable thing to say. So, mental health emergency has to be taken absolutely seriously as physical health emergency. Now, on the specific point about the comment by the Conservative Party candidate, I'm not going to comment on it. And I'll tell you why I'm not going to comment on it. I had a terrible experience myself a few months ago of making some foolish comments that were then twisted further, reverberated around the internet. I got enormous amounts of metaphorical shit poured over me, and I got at least one death threat. And I don't believe that the Conservative candidate, much as I disagree with her on so many issues, including issues around mental health, I don't think she meant to say what people have said that she was saying. And so I'm not going to comment on it. I signed a clean campaign. Oh God,
you don't really want a clean campaign.
I signed a clean campaign pledge in this election, as did we all here in Cambridge. I want to fight on the issues, and I don't want to lower myself to the level of people who engage in questionable personal abuse and trial by media and trial by Twitter. So I'm not going to comment further.
Thank you. I'm part of the probably grey green surge, I suppose. First time involved in politics. I've voted all my life. First time in politics, and it's probably a young person's comment really, because the reason I'm sitting here is that after the last election, I was whinging at my choices. In the ballot paper, I had the three usual suspects in UKIP. whinging like hell, and my son said, well, you better get off your arse and do something. So I'm standing as a local candidate, and I'm... and in the comments, leaflet dropping, I'm getting lots of thumbs up. Lots of people are engaged with the Green Party. Lots of people are like me. People of my age, people of where I come from, are thinking green. I think the whole discussion around where it's going to go, I think, voting by what your heart says, I think people are starting to get that, because the last time it didn't work. My question for you, Rupert, is I'm completely new to this, and it scares the life out of me actually doorstepping people, to be honest, but what's the best line that you've got? What's the strongest policy? The strongest policy that people really are engaging you in? So they say, yes, I get that. That's really important to me. So what would that be?
Wow, well, there's lots, but I'll start with one which is very close to my own heart. I'm our national transport spokesperson, and this morning, with a few of the people who are here in the audience, and with Natalie, we were at the train station calling on the government to renationalise the railways and to reduce fares. And that is a signature Green Party policy. We are the only people calling for the railways to be brought back into public ownership and for fares to be reduced. If you want to know, by the way, how we pay for that fare reduction, the answer is by scrapping the horrendous polluting road building programme that all of the other parties have signed up to. Now, that's just one policy, but it is a very nice one. It neatly encapsulates a lot of the things that we stand for, right? Reducing pollution, supporting public services, doing things that work for ordinary people. A lot of people are being priced out of the railways. And of course, like many, many Green Party policies, it's overwhelmingly popular. When people do blind tests, as you may know, they overwhelmingly plump for the Green Party. When people do tests on vote for policies or vote match, it's very interesting. Do this test if you haven't done it. I'm sure that many of you, including some of you who might be surprised, will find out that you come up with being a Green Party supporter. We have the most popular policies. We have policies that other parties won't stand for or don't dare to stand for. That's just one example of them, but I think it is quite a powerful example. It hits quite a number of the buttons.
Sorry, the girl in white there. Yes.
I've already talked about this loads with Natalie. Sorry, I'm a bit quiet. I know I've already covered this, but I wanted to bring it back specifically to Cambridge, the topic of housing, and that's what drew me to the Green Party from volunteering with local homeless charities in Cambridge. And so I was wondering, what your plans are for going about housing in Cambridge specifically, and also homelessness, not just housing for families, but housing for single people, and the stigma maybe surrounding homelessness, and your ideas about that as a problem in Cambridge, because I know that there are lots of students who are interested in that and have been involved in that during their time at university.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very good question.
Very big question. I'll try to respond to it. So one thing I'll mention is that we just this afternoon with Natalie launched our newest report on food banks and on the food bank crisis in Cambridge. This is connected, of course, because some of the people using food banks are people who are homeless. And we launched this report in front of Senate House. Why did we launch it there rather than at a food bank? Well, the answer is we wanted to draw attention to the way in which Cambridge is a divided city. Right? Cambridge is a very, very wealthy city. Lots of wealthy people here, lots of wealth in the university. And Cambridge is a city where last year 4,700 people had to use food banks. That figure has shot up on the previous year. And Cambridge is a city where there are people who are homeless. Some of them are the same people. What would we do about homelessness? There's a whole raft of things, a couple of key ones to mention. One is homelessness is, among other things, an issue of austerity. Some people who are homeless because of various kinds of government cuts and social security cuts. And of course there's the cruel bedroom tax, which is at the root of some homelessness, and which we pledged to reverse. Homelessness is also an issue of inequality. Where you have rising economic inequality, you have more people becoming homeless. We have rising economic inequality in this country. We want to put that into reverse. To come to the broader question about housing, to build on what was said already, I thought Natalie's remarks on that were excellent. We want to ensure that if there are new towns built outside Cambridge, then they are viable from a transport point of view. This is really crucial. If you're interested, some of you may know about the plans for a sort of new mini town at Northstowe outside Cambridge. The transport plans for that are highly inadequate. What that ought to be centred around, when they build these kinds of things on the continent, what they often do is put light rail in there from the beginning. You know, that's the kind of visionary thing that we need to be doing. Designing in public transport, designing in low carbon transport. That's really, really important. And we ought to be trying to make these places relatively self-sufficient and not just kind of dormitory towns for servicing Cambridge. That brings us to the biggest aspect of this, which is that we do, as Greens, raise some question marks about the current plans for the expansion of Cambridge, period. The other parties don't. We do. We say there has to come an end to this process somewhere. It doesn't make sense for Cambridge to carry on growing forever, certainly not if it's sprawling. What should we do about this? Well, one answer to this is that we need to return in this country to something which has been abandoned, which is regional policy, which basically means that you don't actually just allow development to let rip wherever people want it, but you try to encourage development in parts of the country that need it more and not in other parts of the country that don't need it so much. So where needs development? Well, the places that need development, that need regeneration, well, they're not mostly in or around Cambridge, right? And you probably have some ideas about where they are. There are still parts of Liverpool, the West Midlands, South Wales, the North East, etc., which need regeneration. Places where there are massive brownfield sites. Places where, if we tried to rebalance our economy from being so absurdly London and South East centric, right, and having as a result a more and more divided country, right, it could work as a win-win for everybody. So that's the really big picture. But we say, let's try to take some of the pressure off Cambridge and the Cambridge region over the next 5 to 10 to 15 years and encourage more regeneration and development elsewhere. And that will relieve some of the pressure on land and homes here.
Great, thank you. And you in there. I know we're slightly over 6, but I'd already said that we had the questions.
We have the room till 6:30.
Oh, okay. Well, obviously you will leave if you want to, anyway.
Which includes me, I have to run away right now. But I just had sort of 2 quick ideas. Since the question was about more engagement in Cambridge. Somebody that I was leafleting on the street today said, why isn't there more campaigning up in Arbury, which is the place in Cambridge with lots of social housing, relatively poor part of Cambridge, where there would be enormous interest in, especially in our housing and social housing policies and things like that. And we have a kind of reputation as a middle class party, and maybe that's something that we need to address. The other was just a sort of light bulb moment I had when you were saying all these people are saying, I think I've got to vote Lib Dem or I've got to vote Labour this time. Maybe we can invent a new kind of vote sorting where we find a Lib Dem voter and a Labour voter who both really want to vote Green, and they can cancel their votes out and they can both vote for us. How about that?
That's neat.
Wow.
Sorry,
Really neat. Thank you for that. I think we're going to go away and work on that. That's very, very good.
Oh, that's really good.
It's very, very smart. Why has nobody thought that before?
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay.
On the question about Arbury, a great idea. Look, there are people in this room who are, who are Green Party activists, Green Party members, Green Party supporters, possible Green Party supporters or members. If we're going to do more in Cambridge, as with anywhere, we need more of you to step up and join us. I'm doing this almost full time now. I'm not being paid for it. Virtually no one's being paid for it, apart from a couple of staff members that we do now have, which is great, which we didn't have in the past. We've got those staff members because we've got more members who enable the staff to be paid. And we've got more activists because we've got more members and because we're growing. But we always need more. So the only way we can do more all over the city is if more people step up to help us. So that's by way of a kind of plug. If you want to do what that gentleman was saying and make sure that we reach out into more of Cambridge, come and talk to us at the end and find out how you can get involved. Can 1 or 2 people who are activists here show their hands as people who can be talked to at the end? Yeah, so there you go. There's some people to talk to at the end if you want to get more involved.
So I'm going to take that question at the back.
This is picking up a little bit really on the question about Green Party's relationship to the trade union movement. So I've got a horrible cold at the moment, which is terrible for...
I will repeat your question after.
Okay, so I was in Brighton in the last election and I voted for Caroline Lucas happily, and I'm very glad to have seen how she's campaigned in Parliament since then. But I've been slightly dismayed by how the Brighton Council, which is a Green Party majority, has been going about running the council there. Particularly, it's provoked a pretty big strike from the Brighton bin workers owing to cuts that the Green Council, the Green-led council, or the majority Green Council in Brighton has imposed. So it seems that the sort of flagship council of the party is slightly at odds with the national rhetoric about being a party that's opposed to austerity, because it's enforcing it in Brighton, unfortunately. And so that's sort of something that well, I wonder sort of how activists
Yeah.
and members respond to that. And I know obviously there's the straitjacket of the local government pickles cuts, but of course the councillors could take the option of doing what socialist councillors in the 80s did and refuse to enforce the cuts and bear the consequences of that.
Yeah.
That would be what really engaging in an anti-austerity struggle would look like. So
Okay.
I just wonder sort of how you respond to that.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really important question. It's a very big question, so I'll take a few minutes of your time in answering it. So, firstly, to start on the last point. Unfortunately, I don't know if you're aware, but this is a very important point. The law has changed since the 1980s, right? If you impose an illegal budget now, what basically happens is that the government immediately step in and take over, and you're no longer able to run the council. So the option which the socialist councillors had in the 1980s, it's not there anymore. So that option has been, of course, considered by the Green councillors in Brighton, but the majority of them decided not to go down that route because they thought all that would be a symbolic gesture. It wouldn't actually achieve anything. Now, I think that the Brighton Green councillors have done a superb job, I have to say, and I know the situation quite well, of dealing with an incredibly difficult situation. You mentioned the appalling government cuts, which will continue under Labour, under Lib Dems, or under Conservatives after this election. The only circumstance under which they will not continue is if we have enough anti-austerity MPs to force whoever is in government to not continue those cuts. And that means you need to be voting for parties like the SNP or Plaid or the Greens. Unfortunately, 2 of those 3 parties are not standing here in Cambridge, so I need you to draw the conclusion. So that's the first point. Another absolutely key point, this is so crucial. The Green administration in Brighton has been a minority administration. Now what that means is the Greens are the ones who are in the officiating posts, but they do not control the majority in the council chamber. So any time that the Conservatives and Labour want to combine together to outvote the Green administration in Brighton, they can. And they have done so numerous occasions, cynically trying to sabotage the efforts of the Greens to do the best they can for Brighton. In particular, the Labour Party in Brighton have sabotaged again and again the efforts by the Green Party to expand their budget by raising council tax. And that's really, I think, it's just so cynical the way that Labour's done that, and then say, oh, look at this terrible Green council imposing these cuts, when it's Labour councillors who have forced them to impose those cuts. So do be careful if one is trying to judge the Green councillors, not to judge them too harshly. It's Labour councillors actually who bear a lot of the responsibility for what's happened in Brighton. And then the final point I'd like to make is, as I say, I think based on my knowledge and my experience there, I've spent quite a lot of time in Brighton in the last several years, that the administration, the Green-led administration in Brighton, have on balance done a superb job. You mentioned the strike. That of course has all gone very quiet. Why? Because it's been settled. Why did the strike happen in the first place? Well, to be absolutely frank with you, it was because some members of the trades union there were seeking to maintain interests and advantages that they had over against other workers, and it just wasn't on. It wasn't fair. Basically, it came down to gender discrimination. There were a very, very small number of male workers who were getting highly paid and who didn't want that situation to change. And what had to be done to comply with equalities legislation was to change that situation. The previous administration in Brighton had not changed it, so it fell on the Greens. They had to do it. There was no further delaying. The strike was very unfortunate, but it's all been completely settled, and that's why you don't hear anything about it anymore. The really good things that the administration has done in Brighton include things like making it a living wage council, bringing in a low emission zone. The public transport situation in Brighton has been transformed under this Green administration. There's a whole long list of things I could tell you if I have time, but I've already gone on long enough. And finally, to say, coming back to your initial starting point, I think you're absolutely right. Caroline Lucas has been a superb MP in Brighton. Even if you're not convinced by what I've been saying, you think, well, I still don't really like the Green Council administration of Brighton. Of course, you mustn't blame her for that. She's the MP. It's nothing to do with the council. I think one thing that's terribly clear as we go into this election is we need more MPs to back Caroline up, and we need more people who will be like, or try to be like Caroline Lucas. If I'm elected, I will back Caroline up to the hilt. That's what she needs. That's what she wants. So let's make it happen.
Okay, person in the purple.
I've been very interested in everything that has been said so far. This island is rather insular when it comes to matters of defence, security of the realm, and foreign policy. What would you say about it? What do the Greens say about it? I mean, you're not going to define foreign policy of the realm, but what is your stance? How would you be the mosquito? How would you raise the questions? What are the points you're going to make for peace, security, defence, money? It's a subject which normally is never raised with the electorate, and it hasn't been raised in this room so far.
Yep. We are, by the way, going to have a foreign policy hustings on the 27th of April at the Friends Meeting House in the evening. So that'll be a great opportunity to discuss it there. I'm delighted with the question. This is a set of issues very close to my own heart. If I am elected, this will probably be one of the areas I specialise in, alongside transport and climate, which are the most central things for me. So I'm a long-time peace activist. I've been a member of Trident Ploughshares, so I've tried to peacefully disarm Trident, and that's where I'll start. We want to get rid of Trident. We say that Trident is no part of a defence policy. Having Trident is threatening to use nuclear weapons, and the World Court has ruled that the threat or use, but also just the threat of nuclear weapons is probably contrary to international law. It's immoral to have these weapons. It's £100 billion white elephant. We should get rid of it, and that should be the starting point. And then we can talk about actual, real defence. And we in the Green Party believe in having armed forces that have a defensive posture. We also very much believe in non-violent conflict resolution and in peace building. We think these kinds of things are neglected. We are we being recorded? Yeah, okay, I can't really say that. We are being advised behind the scenes by a very senior British former diplomat who has excellent ideas on how we could have a less aggressive stance in foreign policy. I think many people would agree in this room and across the whole nation that our stance in foreign policy has been too aggressive. Well, forever really, but certainly for the last generation. Let's talk about the British Empire if we've got time.
No, we do not have time.
So I'm very interested in this area. I think it's very, very important. I would like to see us cooperating more with our European allies in this area, and I have a deep interest in the Middle East in particular, where I spend quite a lot of time. And I'll end by saying that I'm very, very concerned and exercised by the Israel-Palestine conflict, which I think desperately needs to be settled for the good of the whole world. How is that conflict going to be settled? The only way it's ever going to be settled is if Israel's allies, and we are one of Israel's allies, force Israel to the negotiating table. And that's why we in the Green Party have a strong stance on this. We say it's not enough to have the vapid rhetoric that you'll hear from the other candidates in this election saying, oh, we want a two-state solution and we've got to be fair to Palestine and so on. You have to force Israel to the negotiating table. And what does that mean? Well, the thing it means above all is restricting arms and restricting economic relationships. So that's why I'm very pleased that in the Green Party manifesto launched yesterday, we said what none of the other parties are matching, that we will, if current Israeli policies continue, work to suspend the EU-Israel Association Pact, which is a trade pact which basically gives Israel almost as good terms as if it was an EU member. That's the kind of thing that could force Israel to the negotiating table. Unless you do something like that, you're never going to have peace in Palestine.
Okay, great. I'll take one there, and then I'll take one from you, even though you've probably done one. So yeah, you at the back.
I believe that the bailouts that were given to the banks after the financial crash will go down in history as perhaps one of the biggest moves towards plutocracy that this country has seen. How does the Green Party, as of 2015, aim to re-regulate the bank, or actually regulate the banks to make it a more fair society?
Yeah.
And I'm going to take them all, and then you can answer them all.
Yeah.
So.
Oh yes, my point was that a chap came up to me in Market Square today and said, oh, I'm not voting Green because I'm a socialist. I said, I am voting Green because I'm a socialist, which leads one to think that there's like 50% of the Labour vote nationally should be voting Green. Do you think we should have a more assertive approach towards capturing the Labour vote?
Very interesting.
Earlier on, Zoe, you asked nothing about things that would be useful to...
Speak up, Carrie.
Sorry, earlier on, Zoe asked something about things that would be useful for people talking on the doorstep. So my question to Rupert is, when I was in town today, a guy came up to me and said, lovely visions, lots of really nice ideas, but I still can't see how you're going to pay for it. And I know we've got set strap lines on how we're going to pay for things. We've got quite a few things, on bankers, but I want a bit more meat about how to talk to people on the door about it.
Right.
Okay, yeah, go on.
Well, the three questions fit together beautifully, don't they? First point on the paying for it thing is that this is in many ways now I think an outdated perception. I mean, the blunt reality is, if you look at in particular the Conservative manifesto compared to the Green Party manifesto, ours is far clearer on how we'd pay for it than theirs is. Theirs is basically a series of promissory notes. I mean, George Osborne was reduced to saying over and over again on Sunday, well, we sort of hope there'll be enough economic growth for us to be able to pay for this NHS pledge, etc. I mean, it's a complete punt. They don't have a proper, fully costed manifesto anymore, really. The Conservative Party, and that's because they think they can take their core vote for granted. It comes back to what we were talking about earlier, right? And people are still saying to us, oh, well, how are you going to pay for everything, etc., when actually we've got the whole thing worked out. So people haven't caught up with where the parties are at in this respect. But to give you a few kind of concrete ideas, and I've expanded on this in a couple of articles I've written recently, actually. If you want to look at the full thing, check out my article on the News Hub website about this, where I talk about the fact that we are prepared in the Green Party to talk about cutting things that other parties are not prepared to talk about cutting. And that's one of the key reasons we can pay for these things, right? Because we are the only ones who'll cut Triton. We're the only ones who'll cut fossil fuel subsidies. The only ones who'll cut nuclear subsidies. The only ones who'll cut the road building programme. The only ones who'll cut capital allowance. And the list goes on and on and on. There are lots of good cuts, right? The cuts we don't want to make are the bad cuts, all the painful cuts that the politicians from the old parties tell us we have to make, right? So we say no to austerity cuts, but yes to cuts in things that are actually bad, like fossil fuel subsidies, Trident, etc., etc. So that's a key part of the answer to how we'll pay for it. Another key part of the answer to how we'll pay for it we've already talked about. We're prepared to tax things that the other parties aren't prepared to tax, right? We'll tax pollution more. We'll tax wealth more. The very wealthiest will have to pay their fair share. We'll be the toughest on tax avoidance and tax evasion. We are the only ones who are prepared to bring in a land value tax to replace council tax, which will be much, much more progressive. You put all these things together, that's how we'll pay for it. Now, to bring us to the banking question, terribly, terribly important question. In practice, I agree with you. However, it could have been very different, and that brings us to a very important policy that we have in the Green Party, which is that we believe that there should be a significant part of the banking sector which is in public hands forever. I was actually instrumental in introducing this as party policy, and the suggestion I made, which has stuck, is that it could be called the Bank of Britain, right? A bank which is for everybody in this country. A retail bank which is completely reliable because the state backs it forever. Yeah? Now, how are we going to get to there from here? I mean, it would have been much better if we'd have had this policy in place and got the government to do it when the financial crash happened, because then we wouldn't have been bailing out these private firms and creating moral hazard. We would, if you will, have been bailing out ourselves. Yeah? But we can still do it, because the Royal Bank of Scotland is still basically pretty much owned by the taxpayer. So that should become the Bank of Britain. It should never be returned to the private sector, and there should never be any more of those bailouts. Anything that has to get bailed out like that, it's a pretty sure sign that the private companies are not fit for purpose to run it. So it should be run for the public good and as a public service, which of course is a crucial part of what banking is. We forget this because it's dominated by private companies. Banking is a public service. People need bank accounts. And you put these two questions together, and I think it gives us a big chunk of the answer to the question about should we be appealing more to left votes. Now, don't get me wrong, I think that the Green Party can appeal to, well, pretty much everybody, actually. But there's lots of things we have to say to potential Conservative voters, for example, like, do you believe in conserving things? You know, do you think that Conservatism is a good idea? Yeah? Or would you rather rip everything up and have it all sold off and destroyed? Which is what your current government is doing, you know, like with the way they tried to sell off the forest, which, by the way, the Lib Dem MP here went along with, the way they want to rip up our speed limits. The neoliberalism is anti-conservative. So there's lots of ways we can appeal to conservatives, but I fundamentally agree with the question. The easiest win, if you will, in terms of getting people who should be voting for us to vote for us, is to be getting a lot of those people who say, well, I'm left, or I'm socialist, and so on, to say, well, yeah, so have you looked at the Labour Party manifesto recently, and do you know what the Green Party policies are? And once, like we were saying earlier, once people find out what our policies are, once they find out that we're the only ones who are going to keep the NHS public, that we're the only ones who are going to return the railways to public ownership, that we're the only ones who are serious about thinking of the banks as a public service and not just being in the pocket of big money, that we're the only ones who are against TTIP, the horrendous anti-democratic EU-US trade deal that's being hatched, and that will destroy our common futures if it goes through, as all of the other parties are threatening to make it go through, then yeah, anyone who is a self-respecting and intelligent socialist should be not only voting for us, but joining us.
Yeah, good. Right, thank you. There's a gentleman in the back, and a stripy one in the middle.
You mentioned Julian Huppert's vote about the forest sell-off.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Sorry, you mentioned Julian Huppert's vote about the forest sell-offs.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of disillusioned Lib Dem voters that are still thinking of voting for Julian Huppert because he's quite well regarded and not seen as inclusion with the Lib Dem leadership. And I was wondering if you could highlight other votes where you differ from Julian Huppert that might surprise people.
Yeah, well, there's a whole load. It's a very important question, and you're absolutely right. There's still a lot of people in Cambridge who are saying, well, of course, I despise the Lib Dems, but I might still vote for Julian Huppert because he's not as bad as the rest of them. So, and of course, he is in many ways quite a decent guy as Lib Dems go. He is. If you had to pick a Lib Dem, then you know he's one of the ones you might pick.
You're going to call him hard working, aren't you?
Yeah. It's really important to be clear. When Julian says, well, I'm a rebel and so on and so forth, yeah, he's a rebel 4% of the time. Right? 96% of the votes, he's voted with the government. And that's on so many things. The forest sell-off, the bedroom tax, most of the austerity cuts. He's voted for every single budget. The list goes on and on and on. We will, by the way, be actually trying to make a bit of hay of this in the press in the next couple of weeks. So look out for that. But yeah, please, talk to people, try to get them to be clear that there are many things that only a Green vote can get you. And I've just done another article on this actually, if you want to look on the News Hub website and also on the Beamly website, which is a new interesting website for political comment. That's BEAMLY, where I set out Green unique selling points, if you will, right? Things you cannot get by voting for Julian Huppert or for the Labour Party. And we've been talking about a lot of them here. And there's various others, nuclear power, opposition to nuclear power, opposition to GM, standing up for animal rights. You know, these are things which Huppert is resolutely opposed to. So there's a whole load of issues. Do talk to anyone who's thinking about voting for Huppert and put them to it. One final point. There is a very serious risk if Julian is re-elected, and if enough Lib Dems are re-elected, that the status quo will simply continue. If the coalition has a majority of MPs after this election, the most natural thing to happen will be that David Cameron will troll down the road to Buckingham Palace and will say, well, I've still got a majority. You know, they'll cobble together some kind of new coalition agreement, and they'll break half the pledges in that, and we'll have another 5 years. That is the most likely scenario if the Conservatives and Lib Dems together have enough MPs after May the 7th. So I really hope that those people who think, well, I'm going to hold my nose and vote for Julian Huppert this time, don't wake up on May the 8th to find that they're still in bed with David Cameron.
And you in the middle, yeah.
Perhaps particularly pertinent in Cambridge, one of your points on your manifesto is your policy on animal testing. And you say that you will work towards ending all animal testing. How do you propose to justify that in the light of the fact that it's almost impossible to tell how a drug is going to react in a human unless you test it in an animal? And it's almost impossible to work out, for example, mechanisms of depression or severe motor disorders that occur in the brain without without having brains to study. I mean, it sounds morbid, but sadly it's true. How do you propose to justify this?
So I'm a long-term passionate campaigner for animal rights. I've stabbed a lot of hunts, and I'm very proud to say that there's never been a kill on any hunt that I've stabbed. And I protested with people who are now in prison outside Huntingdon Life Sciences, and I've protested against pigeon shoots, and I could go on. I feel passionately about this issue, partly because I think one important way to think about it is this: that there's a rough correlation. It's only rough, but it's quite a good correlation all the same. The more reliable your animal model is, the closer it is to us, right? Do you really want to say that, well, because we need to study depression or whatever, we should be doing more experiments on gorillas and chimpanzees and so on and so forth? I think that's an incredible position to take in the 21st century. So then people say, well, no, but we can still get quite a lot out of studying mice and so on. But the answer to that, of course, is the further away you get from human beings, the less reliable your experiments are. So I was speaking to an animal scientist about this. Sorry, I was speaking to a medical scientist about this last year. And he said to me, you know what? We know an enormous amount now about how to cure cancer in mice. The trouble is that mice are not human beings, and an awful lot of that knowledge doesn't transfer over. Luckily, of course, we're finding better and better alternatives to animal testing. So there's microdosing now, which is still quite a new technology, but more and more successful. We've got much better ways of doing computer modeling than we used to have. I think we can be civilized enough in the 21st century to work for the elimination of animal testing. I don't think we really are a civilized society as long as we're brutalizing animals, especially those animals that are closer to us, which are the ones that are going to be the most reliable. So I'm very proud to be in a party which is the only party which is pro-animal rights and is saying that we are going to work to eliminate animal testing.
But just to do a follow-up, do you think that we will get the same results never testing on animals, or do you think we'll just have to reconcile ourselves to not getting, to not knowing as much?
Well, sometimes things will take a bit longer. But you know, Zoe, the contrary is also true. There have, of course, been famous cases where animal testing suggested that something was safe, which turned out to be disastrous. There have been famous cases of things that were tested on animals which turned out badly for those animals, and then many years later it was found out that they weren't bad for humans.
Yeah.
And of course, and this is the really worrying thing, there are many things that have turned out badly when they're tested on animals, and we've never got anywhere near trying them on humans, and we just have no idea whether some of those things may be perfectly safe.
Okay, I know you want to ask again, but we've run out of time, so you can buttonhole them afterwards. How about that? That's my final offer. I just got the 5 minutes warning. I mean, the 5 minutes ago I got the 5 minute warning, so we're going to vacate the room. But do you want to say something to your supporters? Just like go forth and conquer? Well,
thank you, Zoe. Yeah, I'll keep this very, very short. Well, I hope that by now you're all my supporters. If you are feeling supportive after this, please come and talk to us afterwards about how you can help. If you aren't yet convinced, please come and talk to us afterwards about how we can still further convince you. I think it's been a great couple hours. I'd really like to thank everyone who's contributed to it. Everyone here, Natalie who's gone, and of course Zoe herself. Thank you so much. Onward to May the 7th.